We have such an amazing presenter today. We have Jess Stolman-Rainey from Rocky Mountain Crisis Partners. Here at Echo, we've worked with her another time for different Echo series, and for many people, it was the most impactful Echo session we had. So Jess uses her pronouns. She loves to talk about suicide. She is a suicide attempt survivor, healer, and care worker, and she's the director of program development at Rocky Mountain Crisis Partners. And so Rocky Mountain Crisis Partners provides a statewide crisis and peer lines, RAIN hotline, Colorado Lifeline, and other. And Jess really has focused her career on creating pathways to intersectional, justice-based emotional support for marginalized communities. Jess centers her lived experience as an ex-patient and suicide attempt survivor in her work. In 2019, Jess received the American Association of Suicidology Transforming Lived Experiences Award, as well as the 2019 Cookie Grant and Bill Compton LGBTQIA Leadership Award for Excellence in Promoting Diversity and Inclusion Award. So as you all can probably tell, Jess is incredibly prolific and impactful in the work that she's doing. We are linking a lot of her work and places that can be found in the resource guide, because we want to make sure you all have an opportunity to dig deeper as well, in addition to her podcast, Suicide and Stuff. So I am thrilled to welcome Jess here today. I couldn't think of someone better for guiding us through these conversations. So let's all give her a warm welcome. Jess, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing, and it is ready for you.
Great. Let me get my screen share. Is that working for everyone? Awesome. I'm so excited to talk with you all. I actually started out a lot of my career working in education. My master's degree is in educational leadership and policy studies, which I guess I could have put in a bio somewhere. But I really have a strong sort of passion and connection to doing this work in school environments. I think it's such a great place for us to be able to use sort of the built-in community, leverage that built-in community that comes from schools to really support and help people. So I'm excited to talk to all of you today. I put in the slides this like very long bio with links to work and stuff, because I figured after the fact, you all can look at any of that that's interesting to you, or if you want to follow up with me, I'm not going to talk a bunch about stuff that I've done. It makes me feel very awkward, and I have someone else actually write my bios for me usually. So, so that's, this is some stuff about me. And I just always want to sort of honor the original caretakers of the land that I'm on when I talk. And so I'm located in so-called Denver, which is land stolen from the Arapaho, Cheyenne, Ute, and Sioux people. And if you're interested in finding out anything about that, about where you are located, there's a website called nativelands.ca, and you can check out who the original caretakers of your land are. I think that's important as we do this work. We already talked about objectives, so I'm going to skip through that too. I like talking about suicide so much that it's really hard for me to rein it in and only talk about the things I'm supposed to. So I'm going to try and move through some of this quickly while giving it the time and space that it deserves. So if I go too fast at any point, please feel free to slow me down or stop me. And I will sort of go back through some of the things that we're talking about, because I tried to put a lot of content in for all of you, because I know that this work is really hard in the spaces where you're doing it. So I wanted to just start with some shared language. I try to use language like died by suicide, a suicide death, and killed themselves or themselves, as opposed to some of the other language, especially language like committed and completed, that sometimes have some, either completed has some positive connotations, committed has associations with crime and sin, that can be really painful for lost survivors. I try and talk about attempted suicides or suicide attempts, as opposed to things like failed suicide attempts, which is sometimes what I think we hear that language. Suicide attempt survivors are people that have attempted suicide and have not died. Suicide loss survivors are people who are bereaved by suicide. And lived experience encompasses all of those things and the whole sort of spectrum of the early thoughts about suicide all the way through potentially attempts or deaths. Suicidal intensity is the term that I use to describe sometimes what people call suicide ideation. I think ideation has this really clinical feeling to it, and sometimes people don't want to describe what they're experiencing in that way. So I like the term intensity a little bit more. And then if we're talking about self-injury, I usually talk about non-suicidal self-injury versus suicidal self-injury, because they're pretty different. And then self-harm is a way of referring to that as well. So that's the general language I try and use. I wanted to just start out by thinking about what form our beliefs about suicide. We are so resistant to talking about death and dying in our culture, and that's in general. We're even more resistant to talking about suicide, I think, and because of that, our beliefs kind of get formed in these like secret spaces where we never unpack like why we think about or believe the things that we do about suicide. I think it's less important what we believe and more important that we know what we believe and where that comes from when we're doing this work. Because if we don't know what our beliefs are, they're going to show up in really, really big ways in our interactions with people. And that can impact people in negative ways. And it can also impact us in really negative and harmful ways. So it's really important to start thinking through some of this, I think. So the places that our beliefs are formed come from our family, our communities, experiences we have had, the media, which generally does a pretty bad job of talking about suicide. Our spirituality informs our beliefs. Our geography informs our beliefs. And then sometimes research. Although most people don't have access to a lot of research about suicide, it feels really inaccessible to people. So some of these beliefs show up in a few different ways for us. So I'm going to do just a self-reflection exercise. I'm going to say some statements and then have you just sort of reflect on how you would fill in the end of that statement. And then we'll do some reflecting on where did those beliefs come from that I have, and what kinds of hotspots come up for me, or what feels activating to me when we start thinking about some of these things. So the first statement is people who are suicidal are feeling, and then go ahead and fill in that blank. This could be anything from people who are suicidal are feeling lost, alone, isolated, but you also might have another range of feelings that you might associate with this. So people might have excitement feelings, all kinds of other things. The next statement is people who actually die by suicide, and this would be as opposed to people who maybe attempt suicide but live. What's the difference between people who die by suicide versus people who live? And then think about where did you get that information from? Does it feel like it's information that you're really feel really confident about knowing the answer to, or does it feel a little bit unstable? People who are thinking about suicide make me feel. So we can have a whole range of feelings, anything from anxious. We might feel really compelled to help. We might feel nervous. We might feel angry, especially if we've struggled with things with this person before. There's lots of emotions that come up there. And then when I hear about someone who died by suicide, I think there's all kinds of thoughts and feelings that come up when we lose people. Anything from feeling guilt or shame or concern, sometimes anger and frustration. We can be disappointed by our community, by that person, by their family. Now, if I found out someone was suicidal, I would. What are the steps you would take? I think a lot of us, when we answer this question, want to rely on what we think the law or maybe our vocational ethics tell us or what the things we're supposed to do. And I think that's a place to start. But what are the things that you would feel compelled to do that are outside of that? And this could be anything from calling 911 to sitting with them until they're feeling differently. There's a whole range of things that we might try and do. That's next one is that suicide is okay when. I know this one is a really complicated one, but it's really important for us to address if we feel like suicide is ever okay. And if not, what does that mean? For some reason, I'm not able to pull up the chat right now, but I can see that there's lots of stuff happening in the chat. So if there's stuff that I should respond to, maybe one of the other facilitating people can help with that. So I know this process can be a little bit activating, so I'm going to invite people to like shake it off a little bit. But I think really being able to reflect on our beliefs is going to help us and really be informed about why we make the decisions we do when we're working with suicidal students, their families, when we're dealing with the aftermath of suicide in our communities. Because all of these kind of beliefs show up in all kinds of different ways for us. All right, so I want to start by talking about loss. I think one of the biggest mistakes that we make in suicide prevention is that we talk about prevention all the time, but we know that most people have been impacted by a suicide death. And if we never do the work to deal with the impact of loss in our communities, prevention comes too soon and it's painful and sometimes it doesn't work. So let's start by talking about loss. The pain from loss comes in cycles and not stages. And I imagine that most of you have heard something about Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and the stages of grief. The stages of grief are actually designed, that's research about the process that someone who knows that they are going to die goes through. So those same kinds of experiences of grief might be true for people who have lost someone else. But what we know about that grief is that it shows up. Grief is so painful for our brains, and our brains can't process it all at once. So our brain will actually shut it off. So we don't feel it all the time. And it comes in cycles. So it hits people like waves. And I'm sure that's something that you've experienced before. And sometimes that idea about stages makes us think if we've like checked all the boxes for stages of grief, then we're going to be fine. We've done it. Like I was angry, I did bargaining, and now I'm done. I'm done with grief. But sort of the reality about grief and the way that it functions for people is it's more like you start carrying this backpack, this heavy load, and you build the muscles over time to carry it. And it's just something that carries with you over time, as opposed to something that you go through the stages and it's over. Loss slows us down. It does this physically. So people who are experiencing grief actually have heavy arms. They have this experience of feeling heaviness in their arms and legs. It's hard for us to get out of bed. It actually slows our metabolism down. It slows some of our other systems down, including our immune system. So people who are experiencing grief actually get ill really often as a part of that experience. And loss slows us down because it's asking us to take the time to honor the people that we've lost and what has changed. Loss can make us afraid too. It makes us think about our own mortality, makes us think about other people that we love that we lost. And that feels complicated, right? Where people, especially in the US, where people who tend to not think about grief and loss and death, and when we lose someone, it makes us confront all of those things, particularly if we're losing young people, because that's not something we prepare for. There's no such thing as really closure. The idea of sort of closing the book on something doesn't quite work when it comes to loss and grief. Loss just changes who we are. It changes our relationship to ourselves and our communities. And mourning, mourning is the external expression of grief. Mourning is a way of honoring people. And sometimes we treat mourning like there's something wrong when people are experiencing it. But it's really just this beautiful way of honoring the thing that was lost. And the more that we can collectively do that together, the better our grief process goes. So instead of the stages of grief model, I like to use this model, which has a very, very complicated scientific name that I don't love using. But basically, it is a model of grief where we have these everyday life experiences, and we move back and forth between our experiences of grieving versus experiences of healing. So we bounce back and forth between things like remembering and honoring and doing things, mourning, traditional grief work. And then some of the other things that are connected to healing, like doing new things and making life changes, being distracted from it, and sometimes even denying that the grief is there, so that we can start doing new things. And so this really tends to resonate with people a little bit more about what their experience of grief is like, is moving back and forth between these two things. It's called the dual process model of grief. And if people would like the actual article that this was produced in, I can send it to people after the session. So there's all kinds of common grief expressions, everything from anger, blaming, guilt, and numbness, all the way through things like substance use, absenteeism, both at work and in school, and then presenteeism, which shows up as like people still attending to the things in their life, but not really being there. And I'm sure all of us have had that experience. Like sometimes I have that experience at like 2 o'clock every day, actually, like after lunch, where I'm like, oh, I'm sleepy. So I'm like here, but I'm not really doing a great job at working. Those experiences become more common when people are experiencing grief. And all of this is a whole lot to be happening when people are trying to learn and grow and like deal with body changes and deal with family changes and all of the other things that life is throwing at us. Dealing with this on top of it is really complicated for people. And oftentimes people feel like they're experiencing this stuff alone. So if we can help people feel more connected, it's really powerful for us to go through grief together instead of in isolation. Suicide loss is different than other kinds of grief because the survivors usually don't know why the deceased person decided to take their own life, and they may never know. Even when people leave suicide notes, there's just so many questions. Survivors of the deceased can feel like they contributed to the death sometimes. Survivors oftentimes do not have time to prepare for the death. Spiritual beliefs about suicide can leave us concerned for our loved ones' afterlife. And our cultural beliefs about suicide can cause survivors to believe that others have negative opinions about them or about their loved one. And so that all adds this other layer of complication to the way we think about loss.
Jess, I don't know if you're able to see the chat. We just had someone ask, and I don't know if you want to respond to it now. Do teens experiencing grief go through the same as adults suffering loss, or are there other stages?
Yeah, so teens go through pretty much the same things. What we tend to see with teenagers is that their experiences of emotions tend to be a little bit more poignant than ours. And that's because these are experiences they haven't had before, right? Most of us as adults have lost someone at some point, not necessarily to suicide, which brings up a whole set of things, but teenagers' experiences of emotions feel so much more intense to them because it's oftentimes the first time they've experienced it. And so what we tend to see is some more maybe extreme feelings of some of those things, but we also actually see teens bounce back from things a little bit more quickly than adults do. And I think that's part of that's because it feels so intense that they have to do something with that feeling. As adults, we've gotten really good at like not doing things with our feelings to our own detriment. So I think there's so much we can learn from teens about the way that they both express and experience their emotions in these processes. And really sort of centering their experience can be really powerful and helpful. So I'm going to get into, toward the end of the presentation, all of our strategies for dealing with loss. I'll talk about postvention, prevention, and intervention strategies. But I wanted to just introduce that dealing with this stuff, if we don't do that first, prevention is really, really hard because it's going to pull up all of these really bad feelings that we haven't sort of processed through and can bring up huge feelings of guilt and shame. But the automatic reaction that we have as schools is to be like, let's bring in a prevention program right away. Sometimes that's actually not the best answer. Doing some of this grief work is more important and pressing for us. So one of the big questions that I think comes out of our grieving process and just doing suicide prevention work in general is, why do people die by suicide? And I think it's just helpful to know that there are as many reasons that people say they're thinking about suicide as there are individuals who are thinking about it. And so sometimes people say they're thinking about suicide because they are thinking about suicide. But sometimes they say they're thinking about suicide for other reasons. Sometimes they feel stuck and hopeless. They feel like something in their life needs to change. They have big emotions they don't feel like they can describe. They know that people will listen or give them help if they say that. Or sometimes they need a safe place to stay and they know talking about suicide might get them access to a hospital that might feel safer than whatever situation they're in. So then there's just as many actual meanings of what it means to be suicidal. So people are suicidal because it can keep them living, to know they have a way out. They might not feel like they can't take being abused anymore. They might struggle to get access to their basic needs. They've suffered unbearable losses. They feel disconnected or alien. They don't know how else to make something end. So they need something in their life needs to end or change. And this is the only way they can think of to do that. Sometimes they have unbearable physical or emotional pain. They've been rejected for who they truly are. It feels good to know they have control over something. It has a spiritual meaning for them. They might feel haunted by something in their past. They want to be with someone who has died. All of these things, sorry, I skipped ahead for a second. All of these things are legitimate, valid reasons that people think about killing themselves. And I think so often in the way that we think about suicide, we connect it with this idea of like mental illness or a mental health condition. And the reality is that most people who think about suicide are not experiencing a mental health concern. They're experiencing any of these other things. And it's so helpful for us as people who might be supporting them to be able to ask questions about, well, like, tell me how you got to this point. What happened that made you feel like this was the best solution? Because suicide itself is not a problem. It's a solution that people come up with for problems that seem unsolvable in their life. Another way of thinking about this is called is Dr. Joyners Model. It's the model is that people have desire for suicide and then they have acquired capacity. So desire means that they want to, like people want to die by suicide, and acquired capacity means that they can't. And I don't know, that's really oversimplified, so I'm going to complicate it. So people die by suicide because they feel like a burden. They feel like their death is worth more to the people they love than their life is. And they experience thwarted belongingness. Thwarted belongingness is an experience of not belonging somewhere where they did before. Acquired capacity is made up of an access to and familiarity with lethal means and a fearlessness about death. And so people die by suicide when all of those things are happening at once, and they kind of fit into this middle overlapping area. So what you can see from this model is so many people have desire for suicide that will never have an attempt or a death that's going to be high lethality. That doesn't mean that their suicidal thoughts aren't valid. They absolutely are. And they tell us a lot about the struggle someone is going through. But very, very few people actually die who are thinking about suicide. Very, very few people actually even attempt who are thinking about suicide. So the scope of this problem is really big. And we often spend so much time focusing on the people who attempt and die that we miss all of these people who are having desire. So the more that we can focus our prevention and intervention efforts on reducing desire, the more successful we'll be at helping people have a better time living the lives that they choose. We'll talk about acquired capacity and access to lethal means a little bit later as a strategy, but it's probably the easiest intervention strategy when someone is at a really, really highly suicidal point is means restriction. We'll talk about that. So when we think about how suicidal intensity evolves, people start out by perseverating. They're just thinking about suicide a lot. And then they start to decide on things like a method. They access that method. They think about a time and place, and then an attempt or a death happens. So I think about this as like thought, plan, and action. Most people stay in that thought space. What's really cool about this to me is that we can intervene anytime. And the earlier that we intervene, the more likely we are to help someone not get to that point where they feel like they need to take action. But we can't do that if we're not willing to have hard conversations where we talk about life and death with young people. And I think that's something that we tend to shy away from. So I want to bring up some of the tough stuff about this because there's a lot of misconceptions about suicide and suicide intervention that can be a little bit dangerous. So some of the tough stuff is that we know that calling 911 increases people's risk to die by suicide. Police interactions, law enforcement interactions, and hospitalization all increase people's risk to die by suicide. That doesn't mean that there's not a time and a place for that, but it shouldn't be our primary intervention, especially if someone is early on in that process just thinking about suicide. Self-harming is coping. It's a coping skill. It actually keeps people from killing themselves. So if someone is self-injuring and we tell them they have to stop, it actually increases their risk to die by suicide. So we want to address that self-harm in a different way than just saying, just stop. We have to replace that with something else that helps them de-escalate those feelings. We know that means matter. 80% of suicide deaths in Colorado are by gun, and something like 84% of gun deaths in Colorado are also suicide. So this is complicated. Talking about guns is really, really hard. There's really, really great research and tools to talk about means restriction. There's a program called CALM, and I included it in the resources here. It's a 2.5-hour training that you can take for free online that teaches you how to talk about lethal means restriction, everything from guns to any other means that people might use. But we know that people using guns are the least likely to be rescued when they're thinking about suicide. And then the other thing is that contagion or ideas about contagion are not actually realistic and don't reflect what happens in communities. We do see clusters of suicides, but they're not actually copycats in the way that people think about that. What tends to happen is conditions that bring people to think about suicide are often clustered in communities. Those conditions exist. And then when suicide becomes an option or as a solution to people, then they're more likely to use it. And I can direct you to some research about that if that's a specific area of interest for folks. Anna Mueller has some really lovely research about that that's really helpful in understanding how contagion actually happens. All right, so let's talk about what works. In schools and communities, it is helpful to be able to identify people at risk through screening or conversations. It's helpful to increase help seeking so that people know how to access care. Providing mental health services helps. Responding to suicide losses and attempts instead of silence around those. developing policies and processes before something happens. And I gave you 2 resources that have sample policies. So you can just copy and paste all of that and fill in your school name to start building those. Making sure that people are able to meet their basic needs. So things like food is suicide prevention, shelter is suicide prevention, living in a home that is safe is suicide prevention. Developing life skills is suicide prevention. Learning mental health skills is suicide prevention. Training our faculty, staff, and students in some different models of suicide intervention, which will all be referenced in those resources that I gave you, are helpful. Having trusted and trustworthy adults. So if we can be people that are worthy of our students' trust, that's suicide prevention. Addressing underlying and systemic concerns is suicide prevention, and limiting access to firearms can be suicide prevention. I want to be clear that I don't mean that we should not have firearms. That's not really the position I would take on this, but we need to have some safety measures around firearms so that they're not easily accessible when people are in that heightened state. Between individuals, the things that work when people are suicidal are feeling connected, caring for each other, and making space for people to experience pain and hope. One of the things we try and do is move people out of pain and into hope right away. That doesn't help, folks. Like, we need people to be able to experience pain and have people witness their pain and say, yes, it is hard, it is painful, and I still want you here. How do we make that happen? That's where sort of individual suicide prevention is most effective. So this is just a set of links for everyone to the different toolkits and the Suicide Prevention Resource Center, where you can look at all kinds of options for prevention programming. The prevention and postvention toolkits are excellent and have sample policies. They even have letters that you can send if a sample letter that you could send if a student died by suicide. Really, really helpful stuff. And if you want to get in touch with me, here's some ways to find me. Both online and email, and you'll all get a copy of this, so you'll be able to access all of that. Okay, so I made it in just barely the amount of time I was supposed to. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing, and then so that I can see the chat, because I feel bad that I couldn't respond to any of that.
We had an opportunity to review the chat and also take a look at those questions for those groups who put questions in. Thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and start asking Jess some questions based on what you put in the chat. So the first one that we have, this is from group 2. They said people can get rushed through grief and mourning. Can we have any advice in being sensitive to that? It's hard to do when you don't have much experience doing it. And also if there's any resources forthcoming that can provide support in that topic.
Yeah. So I think that's true. People get rushed through grief and mourning for every kind of loss. And I think it's particularly true with these sudden traumatic losses. What's interesting about it is, like, when you look at it from a community perspective, you're going to have folks who weren't deeply impacted, and it's okay to not be deeply impacted, right? And so they just want to get back to things being like business as usual. And then you're going to have a whole range to people who are like deeply impacted for a long time. And so my general suggestion is that we allow things to return to sort of normalcy with this added support, where there's options for people to go to a grief support group, where there's options for things like, I think normally a lot of schools sort of first approach is like, we're going to do an assembly or something. So instead of doing that assembly, having like small group discussions where people can access support and care, and then really doing the work to find out what the needs are that are being identified by the people experiencing them. And then trying to find responses for those over time. So it's less prescriptive about what you would do, and more like having 2 things happening at once, where we can go back to our sort of regular schedule and day and all of that, but also provide that support that kind of exists alongside it, so that 2 things are happening at the same time.
Kind of a continuation question. is someone saying, at what point would you be looking for additional help for someone who's mourning a loss? Like what might be some signs they would need additional supports or interventions?
Yeah. So complicated grief is usually where people would say there's a need for additional supports. Something can't even be categorized as complicated grief until at least 6 months after the loss. I think people need additional support when they're grieving, just always. So anytime you can access it, I think that's great. There's a suicide loss support group called Heartbeats that run all over the country. If you go to the Heartbeats website, it's actually someone from Colorado Springs who started them. Those Heartbeats groups are a really great place for people to access support from each other. Most of the evidence about grief support is actually that like peer support in groups is the most effective tool that exists. It's way better than a clinical support for most people. And people are really resistant to doing group support. Particularly boys and men tend to be resistant to that. So I think any combination of whatever people are willing to work with is great.
We have one group saying, what are we looking for? Just as, a teacher, administrator, what are we looking for not only in students, but also in staff? What are some signs that they might need some support or be experiencing suicidal intensity?
Yeah. So I think that's so complicated because it shows up really differently for everyone. And I think it's a better investment as a community or as a school to create pathways for people to ask for support than it is to try and seek people out. So I think sometimes we go to this like surveillance mentality. Most people don't like feeling surveilled. And it often makes people less likely to access support. So if we can create an environment where there are pathways to care for people, that's more likely to be successful. There are lots of schools that do sort of universal screening kinds of programs. And those are fine. I think they can be helpful. You will maybe find out who is suicidal in that moment. But they don't do a whole lot more than that. So a lot of schools do like things like SOS, signs of suicide. And that's a program that's really designed for mass screening kinds of stuff. But if we can start normalizing accessing care in general, really making sure that our teachers like utilize and know about the EAP utilization in most schools is like 0.02% or something really low. Things like that are much better pathways to being able to support people. Inside the prevention guide for schools, there's tons and tons of resources for all of that stuff as well.
And just as a heads up to everyone in the group, I am going through questions that were posted in the chat in the document. But if you have questions that are coming up as we're having this conversation, please put them in the chat. For whatever's coming up for you now, if you have follow-ups. So we had one group saying, how do we work through suicidal intensity, especially after shows like 13 Reasons Why and all of this glamorized information that's available online?
Gosh, 13 Reasons Why just always comes up in everything I do, I think. So young people's experience of 13 Reasons Why was really different than our experience of it as adults. So I want to start there. Young people did not experience it as glamorizing. There is no real evidence that it increased people's risk for suicide at all. There was an increase in help-seeking behavior. There was an increase in hotline calls, which actually means more people were getting support, not that more people were suicidal. We have no evidence that that's the case. So I think that's a complicated space for us as adults are afraid of suicide content that our young people consume. But I can tell you something like 60% of shows on TV are going to have a suicide in them. Like they're already exposed and they're talking about it probably more than we are. It's us who are uncomfortable. So the best thing that we can do is get ready to have those conversations and have them effectively with youth, and worry a little bit less about if we think that we're going to like glamorize or romanticize it. One thing we could do is talk about Romeo and Juliet differently, because that's part of the canon, and we talk about it like this great love story, and it's a really sad story about two kids who fall in love and kill themselves within 3 days. That's not romantic. That's probably the biggest romanticizing of suicide that I see happen for young people.
Thanks, Jess. I was wondering too if that was going to come up in this conversation. We had in the breakout, in our chats, Dane said that their breakout room wondered why you said mental illness is not a big part of the suicide picture, because they felt like undiagnosed mental illness could be a big part of the picture.
Yeah, I think that is a really common perspective. The CDC actually retracted their statement that it was part of 90% of suicide deaths several years ago. They had really, really bad research that informed that. So it's much more tied to conditions in people's lives that drive people to suicide than their own internal experience of mental illness or wellness. I think that oftentimes we want to be able to point to a mental health condition, because then we feel like we can treat that, and then people, like, if we just treat mental illness, then things will be better. But as we've had increasing access to care and increasing diagnosis and treatment for people, suicide rates have actually gone up. So suicide is pretty clearly connected to other things in people's lives that don't have to do with a mental health concern or pathology.
Thank you, Jess. So I kind of had a few questions. I'm going to try to combine them. People are asking about like causes or rates or differences. And so we had people asking about higher rates of suicide attempts among LGBTQIA+ individuals. Is THC in the body contribute to suicide rates? And, rural students, if there are any differences in the experience of suicidal intensity in rural students. So just wondering about these different considerations or factors.
Yeah, disconnection is sort of the core. So when we look at like populations that experience suicide death in higher rates, there's typically an association with that population experiencing disconnection from their communities in different ways. And it doesn't mean that we have like disowned them as communities necessarily, or that we're not bringing people into love and care as communities, but that maybe their experience of the way that exists in the world, maybe their peers, there are all kinds of different spaces where people experience that feeling of disconnection. So that's typically what increases risk. I think part of what happens in rural communities is that there's sometimes people have experiences of feeling really, really different from everyone and noticing the difference between them and other people more than the things that are the same among them. And I think that's a common experience for teens in general, right? As like part of what teenagers their brains are supposed to be doing is differentiating themselves from others, which is also something that increases risk. So in rural communities, when your community is smaller, you might feel less likely to be able to connect with people around certain identities or experiences that you have, even though there are lots of other connections that people can have. So being able to help people sort of be pulled back into the fold and be connected is really powerful. One of the big inclinations we have oftentimes as a culture and community when someone is thinking about suicide is we actually pull them away from everything that is making them feel connected. And I'm not sure why we do that. I think it comes from, I think it actually comes from this sort of biomedical understanding of suicide, is that like, oh, it's something we need to like sort of seek out and treat. But what we know actually helps is like being in community, being more involved and more connected is the space that is most supportive for people.
Thank you, Jess. We just have a couple minutes left. And so, again, if we didn't get to these questions, please look at the resources, reach out to Jess. But the last one I wanted to end on is one group said, what are the most effective methods to enact in our schools? We suggested being a good listener, being caring. What are we missing? So just speaking for just a couple minutes about what people can start to enact in their school communities.
Yeah, I think one of the there's this really, really amazing research about trusted adults that has really come out of Sources of Strength, which is a specific intervention that some of you all might be familiar with that. I know some of our rural communities this year have been running it, or maybe they didn't this year because of the pandemic. I'm not really sure how that all worked out, but developing strong relationships between young people and adults in your community is like, it's like one of the best things you can do, and it's so accessible for us. So starting to think about like, how do you mobilize your staff around thinking about connection and meaningful relationships with students. I think that's like the lowest hanging fruit to me when it comes to suicide intervention, is really forming those strong relationships.
For more information about Project Echo and upcoming Echoes with the University of Denver, please visit mortgage.du.edu/echo or follow us on Twitter at echo_du_MCE. Thanks for watching.